This is Baker Street, the oldest station on the Underground, and to my mind, one of the most characterful. In 2016, these platforms, now used by the Circle and Hammersmith and City lines, were voted at number 4 on a poll of London transport design icons. Oh, sorry, that should be Transport for London's design icon. You know what I mean. They feel very Victorian, even with the smoke vents filled in with electric lights, even with modern trains going through every few minutes. But back in 1863, they looked more like this. In those days, this was the Metropolitan Railway. Now, you may notice something odd about the earliest images of the Metropolitan Railway. The trains look kinda wide. Victorian artists weren't above taking liberties with proportions, particularly if they were trying to sell train tickets. But in this case, they were dead on. Train tracks in mainland Britain are normally laid to a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails, but those on the Metropolitan were built to 7 feet and 1/4 inch. Why was that? 4 feet 8.5 inches seems pretty arbitrary, and in a sense, it is. One of the most prominent engineers in the early days of railways was George Stephenson, who had started out working in mines in Northumberland. The coal carts in the mines ran on rails 4 feet 8.5 inches apart, a gauge that it's said dates back to the Romans. When he developed his early steam locomotives, that's the gauge they had to run on. He would subsequently build the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the first steam-powered public railway, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the first intercity railway. And wait a second, you in the comments section, I see you, Liverpool and Manchester, first intercity railway. If you disagree, then take it up with the historians. Anyway, George Stephenson being the father of the railways and all, his standards were widely adopted by other engineers, including his son Robert. This wasn't vanity. George Stephenson was of the opinion that the future of railways lay in a national network. And he was, of course, right. By the end of the 19th century, you could send a wagon of goods to just about anywhere in the country. But not everyone agreed with the Stephenson gauge. The most prominent objector was this man. Isambard Kingdom Brunel was an engineer who wasn't overly concerned with what other people had done before him. If he thought things could be done better, then he'd do it. Sometimes this worked, but often it didn't. Brunel was hired to build the Great Western Railway, a main line from London to Bristol. And while he and Robert Stephenson were good friends and would remain so, Brunel thought he could do better than the Stephenson way. He was going to rethink railways, literally, from the ground up. In a sense, what he invented was the 19th century equivalent of high-speed rail, a precisely engineered main line designed to be as straight, direct, and level as possible, with no regard for what had come before. To this day, rail enthusiasts refer to the line as Brunel's billiard table, and to Brunel's way of thinking, 4 feet 8.5 inches wasn't wide enough. He favoured a gauge of 7 feet, with an extra 1/4 inch to be on the safe side. In many ways, Brunel was right. The Great Western's engines were faster and stronger than anyone else's locomotives. Their wagons could of course carry more cargo, their coaches more passengers, their trains were more stable. Brunel would build several more railways to his broad gauge. Unfortunately, the Stephenson gauge was not only well established, but it was more common. While Brunel was filling the west of England with 7-foot track, the rest of the country was being crisscrossed by what the Great Western called narrow gauge, and what everyone else called standard gauge. And as the different lines connected up, a real problem was arising. Wherever the broad gauge met the narrow gauge, there was chaos. Passengers had to change trains. Goods had to be transshipped from one set of wagons to the other. It was all very wasteful and slow. Clearly there had to be a universal standard if there was to be any future in the railway network, and arguments over what that universal standard should be were known as the Gauge War. In 1845, the Royal Commission on Railway Gauges was set up to decide the matter. Their conclusion was that, whatever the merits of the broad gauge, the standard gauge was more common. From now on, all railways had to be built to the gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, except the ones that weren't. I don't know why that is. From the 1860s, the Great Western started adding a third rail to their track to enable standard gauge stock to use their lines. This was known as the mixed gauge. In the end, they had to surrender to the inevitable, and in 1892 the broad gauge was abolished altogether. So what's all this got to do with the Metropolitan Railway? Well, the Metropolitan Railway wasn't just intended as an urban passenger line, it was intended to connect the main lines at King's Cross and Paddington, to enable other railways to run their trains between the two and on into the city. Paddington was the London terminus of the Great Western Railway, which, in 1863, was of course still broad gauge. In fact, the Great Western funded the Metropolitan to the tune of £175,000. Adjusting for inflation, that is a lot of money. Not only that, but the Great Western were to loan locomotives and coaches to the new railway. In fact, Daniel Gooch, their locomotive designer and incidentally a great friend to Brunel, designed a special new class of tank engine for the job, the appropriately named Metropolitan class. These had good acceleration and were fitted with condensing apparatus to discharge waste steam back into the tanks rather than the tunnels. So for the sake of compatibility, the whole line was laid to the clearly obsolete mixed gauge. But then things turned nasty. The Metropolitan Railway turned out to be a huge success, and so they approached the Great Western about running more trains. The Great Western wanted a greater share of revenue than the Met were prepared to give, and they weren't too happy about the prospect of losing slots for their own trains. The dispute was unresolved, and just 7 months after the line was opened, the Great Western took their trains back. Fortunately, the Great Northern Railway, the standard gauge company who owned the railway into King's Cross, were happy to help out. They hastily adapted some of their locomotives to run in the tunnels, so the Metropolitan was saved. This was only a short-term solution, though, and the following year the Metropolitan decided to invest in their own trains. These were standard gauge. In 1869, the broad gauge rails were removed from the Metropolitan tunnels, and the stations would be rebuilt to take advantage of the extra space. Weirdly enough, despite the GWR nearly destroying the Met, the two companies were able to repair their relationship enough to jointly take over the Hammersmith and City Railway in 1867. That's Victorian railway companies for you, I guess. Hello all, I hope you enjoyed this broad-minded tale from the tube. If you did, then please do hit the like button and consider subscribing for more. As ever, I'd like to thank my spiffing donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for being the Great Northern locomotives to my Metropolitan Railway. And I'll see you all very soon for another tale from the tube.